Hello, writers and readers. I'm freelance fiction editor Miranda Darrow, here with my weekly video about writing, editing, and the writing life. In last week's video, I gave a description of the historical fiction genre, discussed common tropes, and gave writing tips. I also defined a number of historical eras. The last era that I listed was something that I called recent historical fiction, which I'm defining as stories set between 1950 and 1999. I've seen different definitions of historical fiction, and some very stubbornly still claim that anything set after 1950 are not historical at all and are in fact contemporary fiction. As a case in point, the Romance Writers of America still holds this definition in 2025, despite it being 75 years after 1950. As a Gen Xer who was raised in the 1970s and 80s, watching historical shows and reading historical books about World War II and the Korean War, which the Korean War took place in the 1950s, and merely 20 years ago, they were considered historical then, and I was watching this content. So I disagree with this 1950s post is all contemporary. I think it's time that we make room for a more recent genre of historical stories. Also, as an author, I've written 2 novels set at least partially in the 1980s, and I've definitely treated this as a historical time period for the level of research I put into the writing, even though I lived through the 80s and I remember. All right, I think audiences are ready for recent historicals, as even young people have flocked to Netflix's Stranger Things, a teen horror series set in the 80s, and my boys loved Everybody Hates Chris, set in the 80s, showing a young fictional version of Chris Rock attending an integrated high school. Less for teens, but still very compelling, Fellow Travelers is a Showtime miniseries about 2 gay men who are closeted and navigating the 1950s lavender scare and then also the 1980s AIDS crisis. And another example is one of my very favorite recent historical series, The Americans, which follows Philip and Elizabeth Jennings, who are 2 KGB spies in an arranged marriage, posing as Americans in suburban Washington, D.C., shortly after Ronald Reagan was elected in the early 80s. They have children, they live suburban lives, all while reporting back to the Kremlin and occasionally whacking someone. So let's get to the book recommendations, shall we? First up, published within the last 10 years, Hidden Figures by Margot Lee Shetterly. This is a true story of Black women mathematicians at NASA during the 1960s. This was made into a movie and it was a huge hit. Next up, The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride tells the tale of an integrated neighborhood with Jewish immigrants and Black people living together in the 1970s, looking out for each other. Next up, very popular, The Women by Kristen Hanna is about a Vietnam War nurse who deals with the trauma of war and then by being hurt by not being seen as a veteran, as someone who could have suffered trauma and losses. Also by Kristen Hanna, who writes a lot of historical fiction, is The Great Alone, set in 1974 in a remote part of Alaska, where a traumatized vet moves with his family, and they are not equipped to deal with his PTSD. Another example is More Than You'll Ever Know by Katie Gutierrez, that follows a contemporary woman who investigates a 1980s era crime centered on a woman who was married to 2 men. This features a dual timeline. Next up, one that you've probably heard of, very popular, Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. It was a hugely popular novel that was made into a miniseries by Apple Plus, showing a brilliant chemist whose career was hindered by sexism, the patriarchy, and some bad luck, but she persevered and was brilliant. Another example, Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid is a 2021 novel by one of my favorite authors, a glamorous drama set in 1983 about a famous family and their fateful party. Also from 2021, A Woman in Moscow by Beatrice Williams, a Cold War spy drama set in the 1950s exploring espionage and family loyalties. I like Beatrice Williams' books and also enjoyed The Summer Wives, set in 1951, featuring a post-war fable of love, class, power, and redemption set among the inhabitants of an island off the New England coast. A different one is A Place for Us by Fatima Fahim Mizra. Following an Indian-American family in the late 20th century, this novel explores cultural expectations and identity. As a resident of central Minnesota, I'd be remiss if I didn't hype The Night Watchman by Louise Erdrich, a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel set in 1953 in North Dakota, inspired by the author's grandfather's activism as a Native American. The next one starts a little earlier than 1950, but is a family saga that continues through the civil rights movements of the 1960s, The Yellow Wife by Sadika Johnson. It's a sweeping narrative set in Virginia. I also enjoyed by the same author, Sadika Johnson, The House of Eve, set in the 1950s Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., a story that explores what it means to be a woman and a mother and how much a woman could be willing to sacrifice to achieve her greatest goal. Next up is 5 Wounds by Kristen Valdez Quaid, published in 2021. It's a family saga set in the 1990s in a small Mexico town. And then finally, Run Me to Earth by Paul Yun is a saga about three kids orphaned in 1960s in Laos and how their destinies are entwined across decades. I hope that I've made the case that stories set between 1950 and 1999 are both historical and a great source of inspiration for authors. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share. I post new content about writing, editing, and the writing life every week. This is Miranda Darrow wishing you happy writing!